I am going to talk about the neural origin of cognitive effort. And cognitive effort is difficult to define, but for the purpose of today's presentation, I'm simply going to provide an operational definition, which is the mental exertion required to perform cognitive tasks, process information. This is something that we've been studying quite a lot about over the past few decades in cognitive neuroscience, but we still don't know a lot about cognitive effort. In particular, we don't know what produces the sensation of cognitive effort, and we also don't know whether it has a particular function or not to it. The one thing that seems to be the case is that cognitive effort is very much associated with the cognitive control functions of frontal parts of the brain, in particular prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex. And I would almost say it's axiomatic. If a process involves cognitive control, then it's very likely going to feel effortful. And conversely, if some task involves cognitive effort, it very likely involves a cognitive control process. Now, over the years, there have been two general classes of theories about cognitive effort. And one of these classes is sometimes called the resource-based theories. And these theories hold that cognitive effort reflects some kind of a bug in the system. So it's a state in the system where the cognitive system is reaching some kind of a constraint. And when it's blocked by that constraint, it can no longer function properly and therefore feels effortful. And there have been various types of resource-based theories, but the really most famous one, the most popular one, is the so-called glucose hypothesis, which was popular about a decade or two ago. And the idea is essentially that glucose obviously is the main source of fuel for the body and for the brain. I don't know if I can minimize that there. The main source of fuel for the body and the brain. And the idea is like similar to driving, say, a vehicle, a car. If you run out of gasoline, you can't power your car anymore. The idea is that if you cogitate a lot and burn a lot of glucose, you start to run out of glucose, and therefore things begin to become effortful. So this was a popular idea maybe around 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And I'll just assert that the idea has since then fallen out of favor without really explaining why, just that many people in the field that don't really believe this to be the case any longer. Since then, there's been another group of theories that's been on the ascendant, which I'll call the algorithmic theories. And these theories generally hold that cognitive effort reflects some kind of feature of the system. So it's a feature, not a bug. They suggest that cognitive effort has actually a computational function or purpose. And again, here there are different theories, but the most prominent one is the so-called opportunity cost theory. And the intuition here is that imagine that you're doing a particular task, and as you're doing that task, you're deriving a particular amount of reward from that task. But maybe there's some other task that you could be doing instead, and you might predict that if you did that other task, you would earn even more reward when doing that other task. So the opportunity cost hypothesis essentially holds that cognitive effort is a kind of internal pressure that causes you to abandon the task that you're doing now in order to switch to another task that would be more work. What I would like to do today is present an account that actually hopefully returns us back to these resource-based theories of cognitive effort. And this theory is based off of principles of linear control theory. So what is linear control theory? Linear control theory is a mathematical formalism that was developed in the engineering literature many decades ago, and it's used to direct dynamical systems to reach desired or particular goal states, and it's used for all sorts of things, everything from robotics and aviation and so on and so forth. Just to give you an intuition of how it works, right? Imagine you have a vehicle, say a boat, and it's on the open water, and you want to direct the vehicle from where it is to some goal state somewhere else on the water. And maybe you know something about the environment. So maybe you know something about the wind directions and the currents and their strength and how big waves are and so on. And perhaps you also know something about how to steer the boat, right? So maybe it has a rudder and you know what the rudder does as you manipulate it. In principle, if you could put all that information together in a set of linear dynamical equations, you could then solve those equations to find the route through the environment that gets you to your goal with the least energy possible, the easiest route, right? So for example, you could imagine that sailing between the waves here is an easy route that wouldn't take a lot of energy versus sailing over the waves like this is a much harder route that would take more energy. And an alternative word for this is controllable. So generally, routes that are easy and they don't take very much energy are said to be highly controllable from a control theory standpoint. So as I said, this framework was developed in engineering many, many decades ago, but it's only within the last decade or so that people started to port those ideas and begin applying them to problems in neuroscience. And the leader in this field, the pioneer, is Danny Bassett at the University of Pittsburgh. So they and their colleagues have done a whole plethora of studies on by applying linear control theory to neural systems. And I'm really just following in their footsteps here. So if I were to characterize their approach, imagine that you could divide the brain up into a bunch of different modules, a bunch of different parcels, and maybe you could look at the activation of each of those modules, say using, for example, fMRI. You could plot the pattern of activity at any point in time across all of those modules as a point in a multidimensional state space, where each axis of the space corresponds to the activation of a particular module, right? So this is just showing, for example, 3 particular parcels here. And a point in the state space is showing the pattern of activity across these 3 different modules. But obviously, if we're talking about the entire brain, we're talking about a multidimensional state space. Now imagine also you know something about how these different modules are connected to each other. And one might infer that from the human connectome, right? So for the white matter connections tell you the strength of the connectivity between the different brain areas. So in principle, if you have some pattern of activity across all of the modules and you know how all the modules are connected to each other, you can apply control theory to it, linear control theory. And if everything works out as it's supposed to, you can figure out the control signals that are needed to take you from some initial pattern of activity to any desired pattern activity across the brain. Okay. So what I'd like to explore today is whether this process relates to cognitive effort or not. Right? So in the abstract, what we're talking about is a pattern of activity across several neural modules or units. Right? So these could be modules like fMRI modules, like I just talked about, but they also might reflect, for example, the firing rate of different neurons. Right? So if we consider these neurons, this would be the pattern of activity across multiple neurons. And say we have some initial starting state and we have some initial goal state. We want to figure out the control signals that will take us from the initial state to the final goal state. And control theory will allow you to find the appropriate pathway from point A to point B. But you can already see right away there are, in principle, an infinite number of pathways that will take you from the initial state to the target state, right? That means that we need some kind of objective function that we need to solve in order to find a kind of theoretically optimal pathway from A to B. And one logical thing to minimize would simply be the distance from A to B. So you might pick a straight distance from your starting point to your goal point, and that would be fine. But another thing you might want to do is to actually minimize the amount of control input that you're applying to the system, right? Because if the system can actually get from A to B on its own without doing anything to it, then why not just, I mean, if the system is already working, then why do you need to interfere with it to make it work better somehow, right? So another objective function could be to minimize the amount of control input that you're applying to the system and only add enough control that's needed to get from point A to your target point B. And if you do this following the linear control theory framework, again, it will find the easy routes that take the least control energy to get from A to B. Right? So what I want to suggest is that the sense of cognitive effort is related to these states that require high amounts of control energy for support. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that this does imply a cost, right? Because if there were no cost to control, then in theory, you might as well always have the normative thing to do would be to have maximum control all the time. And it would be like flying from New York to Tokyo in 5 seconds, right? No problem. So if we're applying some kind of limit to the control input to the system, that suggests that there's some kind of cost to it that we need to minimize. And I've already suggested to you that glucose availability is not such a cost, right? So there must be some alternative cost to the application of control. So what I'm going to do now is to set aside that question for later in the talk, where I'll return to what is the cost of control exactly. But right now, I just want to assume that such a cost actually exists and explore the consequences of that. All right. So we want to characterize what makes a task hard, cognitively effortful. And in order to do this, I'm going to invoke this concept that comes from the system neuroscience literature that you may have heard of. It's called an intrinsic manifold. It goes by other names. Sometimes they're called task manifolds, for example. And this is such an important concept that I'm going to take a few minutes to walk through a seminal experiment about manifolds, because this experiment is so important. It really underlies everything I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation. All right, so I'm going to take a few minutes to explain this. This was an experiment that was published in Nature in 2014. And as I said, it's been very, very influential in the system neuroscience field. So this was a brain-computer interface experiment with monkeys, right? So the monkey is sitting looking at a video display. And the investigators have placed an electrode array in the motor cortex of the monkeys, in I think it's primary motor cortex. So they're getting an online readout of the population activity of these neurons over time. And that information is being fed to a computer program. That's your brain-computer interface. And that brain-computer interface is then controlling the velocity, the direction and speed of a cursor on a video display. Okay? And the monkey is tasked with learning how to control this cursor through a process of trial and error, basically a biofeedback mechanism. So the target moves from location to location, and the monkey has to learn how to manipulate its internal representations in order to move the cursor to the new target locations. Okay? That's just the starting point of the experiment. What you find in such a case is that you can now plot, again, the pattern of activity across the population of neurons as a point in a multidimensional state space, which is shown here on the right schematically. So this is from a separate review article. And what you find is that as the monkey is actually doing this BCI task, that state representation will follow some kind of a trajectory through the state space. But what you don't find is that that state representation doesn't actually reach all possible parts of the state space. Instead, it adheres to a lower dimensional subspace that's embedded with the so-called ambient state space, the larger state space, right? So there's a subregion in which the neural representations inhabit as the monkey is doing the task. And that's shown here schematically as this kind of manifold that you're seeing here. So again, this is just the starting point, really, of the interesting part of the experiment. Now what they did is that they manipulated after the monkeys learned the task, the investigators manipulated the brain-computer interface according to two different conditions, which they call the on-manifold perturbation condition and the off-manifold perturbation condition. And in the on-manifold perturbation condition, they changed the mapping such that in order for the monkey to produce the same overt behavior that they produced before, the monkey now had to push the representational state along a different direction along the manifold. So for example, say if before the monkey had to push the representation down the manifold to move the cursor in a particular direction, now it would have to, for example, push the representation up the manifold to achieve that same behavioral outcome. Okay. Then they had the off-manifold perturbation condition, which is exactly as it sounds. In the off-manifold condition, the monkey now had to move that representational state off the manifold in order to achieve that overt behavior. And the long and the short of this experiment is that they found that it was easier for the monkeys to learn the on-manifold perturbations than the off-manifold perturbations. So the monkeys made a lot more errors, more trials on the off-manifold perturbations than on the on-manifold perturbations. And the inference from this is that the intrinsic manifold is determined by the underlying neurophysiology and neural anatomy of the underlying neural network, and especially the connectivity structure of the underlying neural network. Right? Because the synaptic connectivity permits a particular repertoire of possible neural states that can be naturally produced by that system. And that's what we see in the intrinsic manifold. And yet there's a whole space of neural states that neural network cannot produce very easily. And those states, because by definition they're lying outside the repertoire, are off the intrinsic manifold. So that's the concept. But what we'd really like to do is formalize these ideas somehow to get some mathematical and computational traction. And for this purpose, I think it's reasonable, since we're talking about populations of neurons, we can simulate this using artificial neural networks. And so for this, we're going to take a recurrent neural network approach. And we're going to take a relatively simple, vanilla recurrent neural network, such as the one that you see here. This is a basic recurrent neural network. And we're going to represent our neurons with these different abstract units. So they're X. So each of these little circles is a unit. It takes on some continuous firing rate. So this X is a vector. And the state X is determined by two things. First of all, it's determined by its own recurrent connectivity, right? So all of these neurons are projecting back to each other, and that goes through this matrix A, specifying the connectivity. And the state X is also determined by any external input that's applied to the system. And that external input goes through this vector U that's put through this feed-forward matrix B, representing the external input to the system. And the equation describing this is this one down here. This is a differential equation describing the change in the vector X over time. And you can see it says exactly what I just said, right? You can see it depends on its own representational state at any particular time, and that information is passed through this recurrent matrix A. And it's also determined by this external input in this vector U that's passed through this feed-forward matrix B. All of this is added together, and it goes through a nonlinear activation function because we assume that the neurons are nonlinear. Right? They have some maximal firing rate. Okay, so this is all pretty standard so far, but note that we've already reached a problem, right? Because what I'd like to do is apply linear control theory to this system. And already we see that this system is not linear, right? Because we have this pesky nonlinearity in it. And so what we're going to do is a trick, which is simply to ignore that nonlinearity and assume it's not there. Okay. Now, just to be clear, we're not saying that the actual systems are not linear, right? So obviously the neural systems of the brain are nonlinear systems. And the neural networks, importantly, that we're using to simulate the neural systems are also nonlinear. But we're analyzing the dynamics of the system using linear control theory. So even though the system is nonlinear, we're analyzing it by assuming linearity to see how hard that assumption gets us, whether we'll be successful or not. And this is really convenient, right? Because now, if we assume linearity, then we can port all of that mathematical architecture that comes from the engineering literature and now apply it to neural systems very naturally and easy. right? So we have this system, and remember what we want to do is find the appropriate control signals that take you from an initial state to some target state. And that minimizes the amount of control input, assuming that there's some kind of cost to it. So first of all, we need to describe this cost in the abstract, right? And this is called the control energy. And it's basically the Euclidean norm of the control input integrated from the initial state to the target state. In other words, basically, you're taking the size of that vector and integrating it over time. So you want to minimize the amount of control input to the system as the system is being operated. And most importantly, now, from linear control theory, that provides us with a mathematical object that will be very useful to us. And this is called the controllability gramian, which you see here, right? So the controllability gramian is this is a matrix, WC. It's just a matrix. And I can't prove where it comes from here, but I can give you an intuition of what it's doing. You can see that this matrix depends, first of all, on the matrix of recurrent activity A here. And the controllability gram also depends on the input matrix B here. And these are integrated over time. So the controllability gramian is telling you something about how the inputs to the system interact with the natural dynamics of the system over time. But what's really important to us is that if we can compute the controllability gramian, we can then do an eigendecomposition on the controllability gramian. You can find the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of the gramian. And very importantly, the eigenvalues and eigenvectors tell you which directions in the state space require more or less control energy in order to travel. So the eigenvectors with large eigenvalues require relatively less control energy, and the eigenvectors with small eigenvalues require more control and energy. And so hopefully this will now give us a mechanism to talk about what is on manifold versus off manifold in a more formal way now. So just to get to the basic proposal that I want to propose to you today is the following idea. In the abstract, we're talking about an extremely high dimensional system, right? So the brain has maybe about 86 billion neurons. And it should be clear that most of these states will be totally inaccessible to the system, right? So for example, all of the neurons can't be active at the same time. All of the neurons can't be silent at the same time or else you'd be dead. None of the neurons can exceed their maximum firing rate, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you could think of other constraints as well. On the other extreme, there's this region of the state space that we seem to inhabit most of our daily lives that I'm calling the intrinsic manifold, right? It's the region where things come easy. You can do things habitually and rather naturally. And it's a lower dimensional subspace. What I want to suggest is that the transition from this low dimensional easy subspace to the inaccessible area is not binding. It's not like walking around an empty room and then hitting a wall, right? But maybe there's an intermediate region that has more of a viscous quality that you can pass through that region, but it takes energy for support in order to be in that region. And it's this subspace that I'm calling the control sphere. It's a high energy region that you can reach, but only by applying extra energy to it. So these are intermediate states requiring high control energy. So if you agree with the supposition, or you entertain it, then that should raise some other questions immediately. So for example, what are the nonlinearities that determine the outer boundaries of this control sphere? But also another question is, does travel through the control sphere feel like anything? And of course, I'm going to suggest it feels effortful. All right, I want to pause for a moment just to make an analogy that I think is very telling. Right? So here on the left, you see essentially what I just described about artificial neural networks from the point of view of a control theory framework, right? So you've got this recurrent neural network that's basically doing much of the task, and you've got this control input that's helping the network do the task. Now, there's another feature that I haven't described in detail just for lack of time. But in order for a controller to apply control appropriately by using some kind of feedback control mechanism, the controller has to know the state of the system, right? So you have to know where you are in order to generate the appropriate commands to get to where you want to be, right? So the controller has to have a readout of the state of the system. And therefore, this system is also equipped with what I'm calling an observer, for lack of a better term, whose simple job is to read out the state of the system. That information is then passed to the controller. The controller then could, in theory, act on that in many different possible ways in order to apply control appropriately. This is very reminiscent to how many people think about the application of cognitive control in cognitive neuroscience. What you're seeing here is a classic neural network model of cognitive control. This happens to be of a Stroop task, which I'll talk about actually in a little bit of detail in a moment from now. But I just want to point out that this particular model, I think, was so influential that it helped to define an entire framework of cognitive control in cognitive neuroscience. So that's why I'm singling it out here. You'll note, without going into too much details yet, there is a module here in black that's basically responsible for the basic task dynamics. It's responsible for reading in input from the environment and executing responses in a more or less automatic fashion. And then there are two further control modules. On the one hand, you have sometimes what's called a task module, and this task module applies top-down control to the system, and it helps the basic habitual module do tasks that it doesn't do very well, basically, that requires control for support. And then there's a separate module that monitors the state of the system. It basically determines the state of the system and feeds that information to the control module so that the control module can apply top-down control appropriately. And you can see the analogy I'm making here. There's a direct one-to-one correspondence, which I think actually is a meaningful correspondence, not incidental. Furthermore, there's strong reasons to believe that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is actually applying this top-down control, not just from fMRI, but there's also causal evidence from lesion studies and from transcranial magnetic stimulation and so on. Anterior cingulate cortex, the portrait is a little bit more complicated, but I think there's also good evidence suggesting that it has some kind of monitoring function as well and is sensitive to the state of the system. Okay, so now I want to return to some of these questions that I set aside from the beginning. Remember, at the outset, I said that there are two general theories of cognitive effort: the resource-based theories and the algorithmic theories. And the people who support the algorithmic theories generally raise two reasonable questions against the resource-based theories that really, I think, need to be addressed. So I'm going to address both of them here to the best of my ability. So I still haven't specified what exactly that cost is, right? What is the cost of control that needs to be minimized? And I've already suggested that it is not glucose availability. Again, I haven't said why, but people generally think it's not the availability of glucose. So if it's not that, what is so costly? And I want to point out that resource consumption is not only limited by the availability of the resource. The resource consumption tends to be limited by other factors as well. And a very important limiting factor is the waste that is produced when you consume that resource. This is the reason, for example, that one of the reasons that nuclear fission isn't used as much, because it produces so much waste that's so dangerous. And we're all familiar, for example, with greenhouse gases, also a problem. So energy consumption, resource consumption is never 100% efficient. It always produces some kind of waste, and that waste needs to be dealt with appropriately. So maybe the same thing is happening with cognitive control, that even though a lot of glucose is available, when actually you use that glucose, it's producing waste products that are building up in the system that are inflammatory or neurotoxins and need to be cleared away. So, for example, we know that when neurons are active, they produce amyloid beta proteins, and those amyloid beta proteins aggregate in the interstitial fluid that surrounds neurons. And in fact, it appears to be the case that when people go to sleep, that space around the neurons opens up, and those amyloid beta proteins are actually flushed out of the system, and they're cleared out through the so-called lymphatic system. So maybe cognitive effort is kind of a pause in control to allow the system to take a kind of mini sleep and clear the waste products away from the brain. There are other metabolites that are produced as well, like glutamate and lactate. And in fact, there's another experiment done by a colleague of mine that I'll return to in a moment, where you looked at glutamate. So the idea, one possibility then, is that cognitive control is costly because it produces neural waste. Cognitive effort is a kind of pain signal, if you will, telling the system to hold off in order to clear out that toxic waste. So that was the first question. The second question that's often raised about the resource-based accounts is why is the cost specific to cognitive control, right? Because we know, it's clear that the brain is always active, right? So even if you're asleep, there are neurons working, they're producing waste that needs to be cleared. If you're watching TV, your visual system is working. No matter what you're doing, neurons are working and producing waste that needs to be cleared. So if cognitive control is producing some kind of waste product, that cost has to be specific to the cognitive control mechanism, unique to it. And so we need an answer to that. I don't have the answer, but I have some ideas that I think are reasonable answers to it, and I think they're ultimately testable. And they're not mutually exclusive. Here are two possibilities. One possibility, right? There are some theories and models of cognitive control that hold that cognitive control operates by binding by temporal synchrony, right? So, for example, my colleague Tom Verhutz at Ghent University has a computational model of cognitive control in which the basic idea is that if you're not on task, you have these different modules in the brain doing their own thing. But then when you come on task, you have this synchronizing mechanism that's bringing all the modules into synchrony so that they can communicate with one another effectively over long distances. And according to this model, that mechanism of synchrony happens at the gamma frequency, right? So you have this very fast binding mechanism. And gamma happens to be actually place very high energy demands on the system because essentially, as it's understood, there are computational models of gamma that basically have an excitatory neuron linked with one or two inhibitory neurons, and they're very rapidly turning each other on and off over and over again. And that demands a lot of energy. All right. So perhaps what's happening is that when you're applying cognitive control, you need to bring all of these modules together as a unified framework over long distances with very high temporal fidelity at the gamma frequency. And that requires a lot of energy in order to do that, and therefore produce a lot of waste. Another possibility that's not mutually exclusive with this, right? One of the features of cognitive control is that even though a task might be effortful at first, generally speaking, the more you practice at that task, the more habitual it becomes. And it becomes easier, right? So many of us have experienced learning to drive. It's difficult at first. You have to pay a lot of attention, but after whatever, 10 or 20 years, you're, maybe texting in one hand, hopefully not, but right, and the wheel on the other, and so on. It becomes automatic, right? And that's true of very many tasks. I don't know, maybe not all tasks of cognitive control, but with most of them, it's a feature of cognitive control. And that directly implies a learning mechanism, right? So you're switching from some controlled mechanism to some habitual mechanism. So learning is going on. So that strongly suggests that there's some kind of synaptic plasticity going on that's making that process habitual. And that synaptic plasticity is going to place very high energy demands on the system, right? Because in order to develop these new synaptic connections, you have to shunt around proteins to different places. There are, like, for example, catecholamines like norepinephrine that's arousing the system. That places energetic demands on as well. So, so we can assume that maybe it's not the control process itself that's producing the waste, but it's something that's happening with the control. Whenever control happens, there's other learning processes happening. And that's really demanding a lot more energy and therefore producing more waste. Okay. So I should say that my lab is really at the outstep, the first steps, the beginning stages of this process. So I don't unfortunately have any results to show you yet because I'm just embarking on this. However, I would like to very briefly describe our approach at tackling the problem, because I want to convey to you that these are not just simply a bunch of words, but actually there are research directions that we can actually gain some traction on this phenomenon and hopefully test it empirically. Okay. And so I've organized this according to 3 different approaches that my lab is currently following. For lack of a better term, I call these the forward approach, the inverse approach, and the mechanistic approach. And I'll just very quickly introduce them here, and then I'll spend a little bit more time going through them one by one. In the forward approach, what we're doing is taking existing off-the-shelf, theoretically driven computational models of cognitive control and applying linear control theory to these models in order to better characterize the energy landscape of these models and confirm and or predict what are the effortful states that these theories and models predict. And I will make an argument about why that is an interesting and an important thing to do. For the inverse approach, we're starting with existing empirical data sets, time series data, right? So these can be data sets related to MEG data, EEG data, fMRI, even behavioral like reaction time data. And we're training neural networks to learn the generative structure of those data so that we can then, once the network is trained, we can analyze the structure of the network to understand its energy landscape and make predictions from it. And the third is the mechanistic approach, right? Under this umbrella is really the question. So the first 2 approaches, we're talking about the cost in the abstract. The actual cost could be anything. But in the mechanistic approach, we really want to nail down what that cost exactly is. And there are a number of questions that one might ask about that. But in particular, we're looking for the actual metabolic waste that we think might be produced by control. So it's kind of a fishing expedition. Okay, so beginning with the forward approach, right? The basic idea here is that in principle, if we take any computational network, existing neural network that implements a particular theory of cognitive control, we could characterize the energy landscape, the effort landscape associated with that particular theoretically driven mechanism. And just to get the ball rolling, I've done kind of a proof of principle simulations on this classic model of the Stroop task, just to illustrate how it might be done on more interesting and complex models, right? So again, this is a very classic model of cognitive control. It was published in 1990. If you don't know what the Stroop task is, right, this is this classic cognitive psychology task from the 1920s. There are many, many different variants of it, but the basic idea is that you show people these color words, and the words themselves are presented in different colors. And you ask the participants to name the color of the word that it's presented in. So on the top here, the answer would be blue, and the bottom here, the answer would be red. And you find that people are faster to name the color on the compatible trials than they are on the incompatible trials. It's a very, very robust phenomenon. So this model accounted for that phenomenon and did a number of other things as well, but I'm just going to focus on the basic interference effect, the slower RTs on the incompatible trials. So what we would like to do is actually apply control theory to this model to determine the optimal levels of control that need to be applied to the system in order to do the task. And for that, we need to read out these matrices A and B to apply control to it. And that's very convenient because the matrices are actually given here in this picture. The connection weights are these numbers. So we can just read out these matrices. Sorry, I need to describe this. So the model has a set of input units representing the ink colors, different ink colors, and other input units representing the words. And it has output units representing the response. So the model says red or green, depending on the combination of inputs. And there's an intermediate hidden layer between these layers. And most importantly, there are these control units that are applying top-down control to the system, helping it do the particular task. There's a separate unit for doing the color naming task and a separate unit for doing the word reading task. But we don't ask the model to do word reading, so we're just going to ignore this word reading unit and focus on the amount of control that needs to be applied to the control unit in order for this model to do the task correctly. I'm also glossing over a lot of details, as you can imagine. I just want to give you the flavor of how this works. So we want to apply a control theory to these matrices. And we need to choose a particular type of controller for this to work. We're going to use a linear quadratic regulator, which is basically the most simple control mechanism that comes from the engineering literature and applied to our system. And you might be thinking now, maybe not, but maybe you might be thinking that this is a really simple model, really trivial. And in a sense, maybe there's some truth to that, but I just want to point out some complicating issues. Right? The first one is that, remember, these functions are non-linear. Right? So these activation functions were non-linear, and yet we're assuming linearity in the linear quadratic regulator. And this non-linearity is really important because the mechanism will not apply cognitive control appropriately if the units don't incorporate this non-linear function. The other thing is that this matrix A, this is a feed-forward matrix. What this means is that the matrix is asymmetric. And it's a property of these matrices that they're often non-normal and they have non-orthogonal eigenvectors. As a consequence, often that means that the natural dynamics of these systems can show very transient responses. For example, they can increase very quickly and decrease very quickly. And that makes the system much more difficult. It can make the system much more difficult to control. Okay, so these are things that we need to deal with. The long and the short, the end of the story is that, in fact, when we apply control theory to it using a linear quadratic regulator, we reproduce the basic interference effect, which you see here. So these are the activations of the response units over time, over a particular trial. A response is made when the units cross a threshold that you see here. And you can see that there are faster responses on the compatible trials and slower responses on the incompatible trials. You can also look at the amount of energy that the system requires to do this, and it requires more energy on the incompatible trials than on the compatible trials in order to do it. And then there are other things, interesting things that you can inspect from the model, which I just don't have time to talk about it, but you can look in the state space which directions are more controllable versus less controllable, and how they align with the natural dynamics of the system, and so on. Okay, so you still might be thinking, well, fair enough, but I'm not interested in this Stroop task. So what does it say for me? And what I want to argue here is that these ideas actually should apply widely. And if it's really, truly an encompassing theory, it should be independent of the implementational details of each of the tasks, right? So cognitive control is characterized by a whole variety of different tasks. And a whole variety of different processes, like working memory and task switching and so on. And within each process, there's a variety of different tasks used to test that process. And then within each task, there's often a variety of different computational models. And what I want to suggest is that in principle, so long as any model satisfies some basic criteria that they should be dynamical systems with a basic hierarchical component, one can therefore apply linear control theory to those models in order to characterize its energy landscape. So for example, working memory, right? Very famously, this is effortless. People can hold up to about 4 items in working memory easily. And as you increase the load after that, it gets more and more difficult. Different models of working tasks. So for example, this is a typical visual working memory task. People are shown some array to study. They have to memorize the location of these targets. Then it disappears, and then they have to report it back in a little while. And that can be effortful if you have to remember a lot of things. Then there's a computational model of this particular task that was done by a CompTIS group some time ago. And this happens to be a ring model of working memory. And interestingly enough, it's actually not only a model of working memory, but it's a model of how dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can support working memory. So it has this external excitatory input that helps boost the representational capacity of the underlying neural network. And so the argument is that if we apply linear control theory to this system, we can actually show why these states require that external energy and therefore be effortful. And this is a much harder problem than the Stoop problem because these are integrate and fired neurons. So they're very nonlinear. There's a lot of neurons. It's a high dimension space. There's over 1,000 neurons. Some of them are excitatory, some of them are inhibitory. So it's a challenging problem. But there's a postdoctoral fellow in my laboratory, Tahare Gola Minajad, who's working on the problem. She has a PhD actually in control engineering with an expertise in nonlinear control. So if there's anybody who can solve the problem, it will be her. Just to drive the point home, task switching, another very important area of cognitive psychology that's thought to be effortful. Again, different sorts of tasks. But one typical task is that subjects are shown a series of digits, one after the other. Sometimes they might be asked to classify the digit as being either odd or even. Sometimes they might be tasked with saying whether it's above 5 or below 5. And what you find is that it's much harder for people to switch between the tasks than it is to stay on one task and repeat that task over and over. So there are different models of this, but this is an example of a task switching model that has a hierarchical component. One in principle, and we plan on doing it, applying LCT to this model in order to show what is causing these effortful requirements. My prediction is just intuitively that part of the effort demands stem from the fact I expect that the tasks occupy different regions of the state space. So you require extra control energy actually to move the representation from one region of the state space to the other region of the state space. Right, so there was this very nice opinion paper by Gao and Ganguly several years ago, and they argued that systems neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience really needs general principles that transcend any particular model. And what I'm hoping here is that this is a conceptual framework, a theoretical framework that really goes beyond the implementational details and describes the whole collection of phenomena to get it under one theoretical umbrella. Okay, I know I'm getting close to the end of time, but the rest is going to go a little faster. The second approach is the so-called inverse approach. Here, we want to ask whether we can train neural networks on empirical time series data to learn their generative structure. And this goes by different names, but dynamical system reconstruction is one name, right? So this is actually, there's a whole cottage industry on this these days. There are more and more papers coming out all the time. I'm by no means any expert in it. I'm learning as I go along. But I'm been very impressed by the work of Daniel Derstowitz, who is a colleague not very far away in Heidelberg here. And he's developed his laboratory's developed a number of recurrent neural networks that do this, right? So the idea is that you train the neural network on time series data in order to reproduce those time series as best as possible, right? So that neural network can then learn in its weight structure, the generative structure of the data itself. So this is an example, just an example data set. This trajectory is a Lorenzo trajectory. It's described by 3 variables. They train a recurrent network on these data, and the network can then more or less faithfully reproduce that Lorenzo trajectory on its own. And they've also applied this technique to other, in principle, it can be applied to any time series data, but they've applied it, for example, to MEG data and EEG data and fMRI and behavioral data as well. So So we said, great, and we would like to do the same. So our goal then, one of the goals would be, for example, to take a recurrent neural network and train it on MEG data so that the neural network itself now learns the generative structure of that MEG data. And that structure then is incorporated in the weights of the network. So once that network has been trained, then in principle, we can analyze the matrix A to learn which directions in this particular task manifold are going to require more or less effort to travel through. There are two computational neuroscientists in my lab, Paul Mueller, Xiaoqian Zhao, who are postdoctoral fellows who are currently working on this problem. Why is it useful? Because ultimately, we would like to take this approach and make predictions about what would be effortful states in various different types of tasks. And I can imagine different ways it might be applied. But just to give you an intuition of the thinking here, one approach would actually be to essentially replicate that BCI experiment in monkeys that I talked about already. Right? So if you could train a neural network to reproduce an MEG task, then you could predict in a principled way which directions in the state space are going to require more energy versus less energy, and then ask people to produce those states online using a BCI mechanism, and then see whether indeed particular directions require more or less effort to produce. And we can do this simply by asking them or looking at how many errors they make, or even maybe like through a proxy, like pupil size, for example, a proxy of cognitive effort. Finally, the mechanistic approach. Again, the first two approaches are all about cost in the abstract, but we would like to know something about what actually is that cost. What, in particular, what are the waste metabolites produced by cognitive fatigue? So for this, my own lab is following an approach that's already been developed by a colleague of mine, Mattias Paciglione. So he's in fact already used magnetic resonance spectroscopy to look at the production of waste metabolites during cognitively fatiguing tasks. Basically, what he does is that he takes somebody in the scanner for 6 hours and has them do a cognitive control task over that 6 hours. And you find that as they're doing the task, they found that glutamate collects apparently extracellularly in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as they get more and more fatigued while doing the task. It doesn't appear in control areas. So we would like to replicate and extend that particular approach. So we plan on conducting our own MRS experiment. It's basically the same idea about a 6-hour-long task, but they're doing a 6-hour-long experiment where they're doing this task over most of that time. In this case, we're alternating MRS. We will alternate MRS with periods of fMRI in order to correlate the waste metabolites with the bold signal. And we're going to look at two ROIs, the ACC and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which we think are particularly interesting control areas. And then look at the buildup of glutamate and also lactate, which is a key metabolic waste product of energy consumption of ATP breakdown. And a PhD student in my lab, Jiwan Zhang, is a point person in this experiment. All right, so just to conclude, I suggested I came up with this almost kind of goofy name, controlosphere, because I think it's really evocative of an analogy I want to make, which is the atmosphere, right? So you can imagine, for example, aerial flight, an aerial vehicle, an airplane can travel around quite easily through certain regions of the atmosphere. But the atmosphere, of course, has upper limits, and you transition into outer space. And the airplane cannot penetrate those, beyond the magnetosphere. So there's some region that a plane can fly and some region it can't travel to. And maybe something is analogous is happening with neural state space, right? Because there are large parts of the state space that we know that we can never go because it's just not computable by brains. And there are evidently these other regions that we can hang out pretty easily just by virtue of the fact that we do. But maybe there's this inner region that we can explore, but it requires this extra input, this extra energy for us to get there. And furthermore, maybe it's a little bit dangerous. And so we want to return back to the ground as quickly as possible where it's safe. And cognitive effort is a way of expressing that danger so that we do return to the ground. And that is it. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to the DHS.